To secure Azure SQL Active Directory authentication, start by understanding the key concepts involved. Active Directory authentication allows users to connect to Azure SQL database using their existing Active Directory credentials. This eliminates the need for separate database usernames and passwords, improving security and simplifying user management. First, ensure your Azure SQL database is configured to use Active Directory authentication. This involves setting up an Azure Active Directory tenant and registering your Azure SQL database. With the tenant, you can do this by navigating to the Azure portal, selecting your Azure SQL database, and clicking on Active Directory Administration. Next, create an Azure Active Directory group for your database users. This group will be used to manage access to your Azure SQL database. Assign the necessary permissions to the group, such as read or write access to specific database tables. To authenticate users, you need to create a service principal for your Azure SQL database. A service principal is a security identity used by server applications to access Azure resources. You can create a service principal using the Azure CLI or Azure PowerShell. After creating the service principal, configure the client application to use the service principal credentials to connect to the Azure SQL database. This involves installing the Microsoft Authentication library and importing the necessary namespaces. When connecting to the Azure SQL database, use the Active Directory authentication method. You can do this by specifying the authentication method in your connection string or by using the Microsoft Authentication library to authenticate the user. Best practices for securing Azure SQL Active Directory authentication include using least privilege access, regularly reviewing and updating group memberships, and monitoring database activity for suspicious access patterns. Additionally, ensure that all users have strong passwords and multi-factor authentication is enabled. In summary, securing Azure SQL Active Directory authentication involves configuring your Azure SQL database to use Active Directory authentication, creating an Azure Active Directory group for database users, creating a service principal, and configuring the client application to use the service principal credentials. By following these steps and best practices, you can improve the security of your Azure SQL database and protect your data from unauthorized access.